Can one misplaced touch kill you? Now, I know it sounds terrifying, but maybe in the right circumstances, it actually can. And it happened not too long ago to someone I knew. Now, Michael was the uncle of one of my good friends. And Michael was a loving father, 2 kids. He had a 5-year-old son and a daughter less than a year old. Now, Michael recently found out from his doctors that he had developed a rare form of brain cancer. And they had to operate on him immediately if there was any chance of Michael surviving. So Michael decided to actually go along and through the surgery. And luckily for him, the surgery was a success. They were able to completely remove the tumor from his brain, and so began his recovery process. A few days later, he started to complain about a pain, an indescribable pain that went throughout his entire body. And so he went back to the doctor, and they told him that he contracted a surgical site infection. And this infection had begun to spread so rapidly throughout his system. It was now within his nervous system. And at this point, there was very little the doctors could do. They tried treating Michael, but nothing helped. And unfortunately, a few weeks after that, Michael died due to his condition. Now the doctors, they went back. They went back to try to figure out how this could have happened. How did Michael get a surgical site infection? But there was nothing to help them out. There was no data to help them figure this out. This is why we need more data. And this is where Sanus Solutions comes in. So let me backtrack a little bit. I used to be a student here at Georgia Tech over a year ago. And I was actually taking a computer audio class taught by none other than Mary Beth Gandy here at the IPaT. And we were tasked to develop a wearable device that sonified information to its user in a meaningful way. And as you can see, that was a pretty broad topic, so it actually took Klaus, my partner, and I to quite some time to actually come up with an idea. But one day, I was talking to my sister-in-law, who's a nurse. And she started talking to me about a subject known as sterile or aseptic technique, which means using practices and procedures in a way so as to help prevent contamination from pathogens. So after our initial discussion, I began to look and research more into this problem space. And that's when I found out that hospital-acquired infections were a really big deal. And in 2011, the CDC reported that there were over 725,000 hospital-acquired infections in US acute care hospitals. And additionally, 75,000 of these patients who had hospital-acquired infections died during their hospitalizations. So that means patients were going to the hospital to get treated for their condition and then dying because of that treatment. So at this point, I was still in my research phase, and I wanted to narrow down the problem space even further. And that's when I began researching about surgical site infections. And for those of you who don't know, a surgical site infection is an infection that occurs after the surgery at the part of the body where the surgery takes place. Now, professionals try their best to prevent this type of infection by scrubbing their arms, maintaining normal and constant body temperature during the surgery, and scrubbing and cleaning the skin at the site of the surgery itself. But despite all this, mortality rate caused by surgical site infections has increased, and researchers and surgical teams, even with the knowledge they have today, still do not fully understand surgical site infections and where they come from. So it's believed that most surgical site infections are acquired during the actual procedure itself. And this fact is supported by the success of many SSI preventative measures, as well as comparing strains of pathogens from the tips of surgeons' fingertips to that of post-op infections. Now, despite much research on SSIs, we still don't know the exact proportion of SSIs that are acquired during the actual procedure versus that of post-op care. And likewise, in the subgroup of SSIs that are acquired during the procedure, we don't still know the exact proportion that is acquired due to the patient or that of the surgical staff, operating room, and environment, and that remains unknown today. So what do hospitals do today to help prevent surgical site infections? They use what we call evidence-based practice. Now, there are quite a few evidence-based practices known for having a high level of evidence. That includes surgical hand preparation, appropriate antibiotic prophylaxis, and the postponing of an elective procedure in the case of an active remote infection. Now, despite all this, researchers don't really know how these infections occur. They use these procedures, and as I said, there's also one other one they use, and this is known as active surveillance with feedback. And this one's particularly important because this is the space in which Sanus Solutions works in. We know that hospitals today have infection prevention teams. But what we want to do is help advance these infection prevention systems and build tools so that hospitals can do better in succeeding in patient care. So what is our solution? Our solution is a system we like to call ORCA, or Operating Room Computer Asepsis System, an AI-based video recording system that's not only capable of gathering video data as evidence for evidence-based practice, but also provides post and live feedback during surgeries themselves. We incorporate machine learning into our system so that as we obtain more video data, as well as user input as to where sterile breaches may have occurred, our system grows more accurate over time. Now, we know that SSIs are a big deal, and through our research, as well as various talks and studies with the CDC, they are a big deal, but there's one thing they lack, and they lack a major source of data. Now, I know data is a word we've all been hearing about recently in the news, but it's due to this lack of data that a lot of SSIs occur. So, from here, we take our 360-degree camera, and we place it on top of the operating room ceiling. We then begin to analyze and monitor the room, the operating room itself. We monitor such things as sterile breaches, positions of all personnel in the room, traffic flowing in and out of the room, as well as positions of the sterile instruments and in their relation to the surgical field itself. So, we know that with video data, we can gain a lot more evidence for evidence-based practices. But the problem is sifting through all this data itself. And it's too much for one person to go. You're not going to go through thousands of hours of footage and seeing, okay, it happened there, it happened there. And that's why we incorporate AI into our system, so that we can gather data more quickly, more efficiently, and also more, with machine learning, we can also build these data models through our data that we collected, train them over time, and prevent surgical site infection, and hopefully even one day predict infection before it occurs. So let me give you a quick rundown of how the ORCA system works. And I'm going to be using a hypothetical situation in this case. So let's say we have a surgeon, and his name's David. Now David is an orthopedic surgeon, and he's about to conduct a total hip replacement surgery, a surgery known for having a high risk of infection when compared to other surgeries. So as David is now about to begin the procedure, our system begins monitoring. And as David's about to make his first incision, his assistant comes up behind him and accidentally swipes the back of his gown. Now, this is an immediate breach of sterile protocol, as the back of the gown is always considered unsterile, and only the front of the gown, from the chest to the sterile field, is considered sterile itself. So, this all happened so fast that David and his team were unaware of it. But luckily enough, our system caught it. And we were able to notify the circulating nurse, who was then able to notify the assistant who breached it with video evidence, and she was then able to remove her gloves, re-sterilize, and put the gloves back on before she was able to touch anything else in the operating room. Now, at the end of the operation, David and his team looked back on our post-analysis, and they saw that there was an unusually high amount of traffic flowing in and out of the operating room. And they then used this data to implement a new traffic-based protocol for all their surgical teams so that, from now on, if they come in and out of the operating room, they will make sure that it's much lower than it was before. So I'll say this word again, and I know I've said it quite a few times throughout this talk, but data. Data is so important in today's society and healthcare, in the healthcare industry itself. And we know that with more data, we can help prevent surgical site infections. So let SANUS help you see what you can't. Thank you very much.